for the doubters out there, they say, well, there's no evidence of this. Well, I mean, I kind of say, well, there is some evidence that the brain exists, but maybe not in you, but in other people, there is some evidence. Well, now we have pictures, right? We have functional MRI pictures that show that there are fundamental changes to the point where we can actually fingerprint diseases based on functional MRI testing. So here we find just not only diseases specifically in this slide, but what we find in this slide are the various parts of the brain that seem to get triggered with when sort of central sensitization is occurring. And some of those parts of the brain include the insular cortex and the various areas, the anterior and posterior parts of the insular cortex, the thalamus, the periaqueductal gray, and the anterior cingulate. When we look at this next slide, these are some of these functional MRI pictures, which obviously have been 3D modeled, to show you this kind of fingerprinting that we can see, which again, functional MRIs are not something that are readily available in our clinical practice, so this is not something that you'll be able to prescribe to patients, but this is meant to show you that these diseases are actually very similar in a lot of patients. The experiences are very similar in a lot of patients, especially when central sensitization exists. So we can see in certain cases, especially like lower back pain, for example, certain parts of the brain are hyperactive and hypoactive. Osteoarthritis, same condition. Postherpetic neuralgia, same sort of situation. Pelvic pain, same sort of situation. So again, what is this telling us? This is telling us that it's the brain that's processing all of these signals. And when our brain processes certain signals in a certain way, we feel, hey, my back is hurting, or this is hurting, or that is hurting. The brain is really nothing more than sort of this computer, right? It's a computer filled with a bunch of molecules and chemicals and neural connections. And when you trigger a certain software program within that hardware, it's going to tell you a certain response. Functional MRI and CRPS, and we use CRPS as sort of this prototypical disease in central sensitization. On the left, we see a healthy subject. So we see this hyperactive, an area that's more active, and then we see areas that are less active. And when we compare that to a typical CRPS patient, we see some of these healthy areas that are supposed to be active, we see them inactive, and we see areas that are supposed to be not active or slightly active, we see them hyperactive. And we can see this kind of data over and over in certain diseases. And that's what's giving us our characteristic response to those certain diseases. Now, obviously, there's going to be variability because every single person is going to report something different with that particular disease. So, for example, with CRPS, I've proposed that CRPS is actually a spectrum type of disease, like an autism or something. There's a spectrum. Traditionally, CRPS has been proposed to be, with the Budapest criteria, which is sort of this all or nothing. You either meet the criteria or don't. But what we're finding is that that's not always the case. You have patients they're presenting with many of the symptoms, but not necessarily 100% of the symptoms. And does that mean that they have no disease? No, of course not. Does that mean that they have all, 100% of the disease? No, they're somewhere in the middle. And we shouldn't cast those patients aside. And we do see that quite often where those patients are cast aside because they don't meet this bucket and they don't necessarily meet this bucket, so no one knows what to do with them, so they just kind of get cast aside. And I think that's obviously a problem because there are, central sensitization is a pathophysiologic process. It's not an all or nothing, it's a pathophysiologic process. And people can be anywhere from that 1% to 100% of that disease being centralized. And when I say 1 to 100, what that means is at 100%, there is no peripheral disease that exists. It's 100% central. The patient feels it 100% peripheral, but literally there is no tissue damage, there's no disease that exists peripherally. But the patient will 100% feel it in their periphery, but they won't know any different. And in those cases, when we do treatments that specifically address the brain, we can see up to 100% relief. Here's a slide that sort of shows what kind of brain reorganization we see in central sensitization. As you can see, as time goes on, the global gray matter change with patients with central sensitization increases. Okay, we see these same patterns with chronic pain because, again, chronic pain centralizes. If chronic pain never centralized, we would not see any type of change with the gray matter or any type of change with the brain because the brain wouldn't know that you're in pain, which makes no sense because that's what interprets everything. It was in 2008 where we described how hot flashes were also a centrally mediated process. And we were able to prove that, again, through stellate ganglion blocks of numbing up the sympathetic nervous system to be able to document, to show that, hey, when you numb up the sympathetic nervous system peripherally, we're actually seeing a central change. Anyway, I won't get into the study, but what it does, it helps kind of solidify this idea that a lot of diseases are centrally mediated, not peripherally mediated.